The annual security conference here in Munich isn't just about the big names and well-known faces. It's also about the special advisors who craft global policies and work at the secret heart of government. My guest this week is one of them. He's Ben Rhodes, a former national security advisor to President Obama. After 2 years of the Trump presidency, how well is Obama's legacy holding up? Ben Rhodes, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thanks for having me.
Arguably one of the biggest upsets of the Obama presidency was the election of Donald Trump, who set out to repudiate a lot of what President Obama did. Why didn't you see that coming?
Well, you know, I think most people were surprised by the result of the election. And I think it was a number of factors. I think the first is that Barack Obama personally was still quite popular at the end of his presidency. The economy was growing, and it seemed like things were set up for a Democratic victory in that election.
And you said being with Obama gave you the confidence that you were part of something that was right.
Yes.
Was there a certain arrogance in that, do you think?
No. I mean, when I say that, I mean that, frankly, as progressives, I think Barack Obama and me tend to sometimes think that history is moving in one direction, that societies are becoming more tolerant and more inclusive, and that we're extending more opportunity to more people and cooperation between nations. But the reality is that throughout history, there's always a backlash to change. There's always a reaction to changes, not just in politics, but in societies. And Donald Trump gave expression to that. Now,
but Americans had been telling pollsters for years before that the country was going in the wrong direction. And that support was waning for political institutions in the country, like Congress, for instance, which was down to 14% at the end of Obama's tenure, wasn't it?
Yes.
So that was a warning. That should have set off some warning bells.
Well, but those trends have been in place for a long time. I mean, even predating Obama. Obama was elected on a platform of change.
He didn't stop it.
The decline in support for institutions, absolutely not. And with something like Congress, the radical obstruction we faced obviously degraded faith in institutions. Obama himself, though, was personally popular. So in a way, he could float above these trends. And frankly, if he had run for a third term, if he could, he would have won. And if you look at the results of the election, Donald Trump got less votes for president than Mitt Romney got in 2012 when Obama defeated him. It's just that Hillary Clinton got a lot less votes than Obama did.
Obama missed the raw power of Trump's rhetoric, didn't he? I mean, on a visit to London before the Brexit vote, you write about this in your book, he told then Prime Minister David Cameron, "When I watch Trump's rallies, I think how potent his message would be from a more skilled politician." It was already pretty potent by then, wasn't it?
Well, actually,
he missed that.
Actually, I said that.
Oh, you said that?
Yeah. No, look, we understand. Look.
So you missed it then?
Sure, but to be very clear, Barack Obama, I think, as an African American, understood full well the power of a demagogue and the power of division and divisiveness. But to pick up on some of the threads in your questions, I think you can overstate that there was some dramatic shift in public opinion in the United States. Again, Trump got less votes than the Republican who lost to Obama. He was able to get the Republican nomination. That, to me, is the radicalization in American politics. Then he was able to defeat a very unpopular opponent in Hillary Clinton. And I wouldn't overread from that there was some enormous shift in opinion in the country in the direction of Trump. There was a shift in opinion in the Republican Party that allowed somebody like Trump to become the nominee. And then there was an election where he beat an unpopular opponent. You
said Obama ended up pretty popular in the country. But for the Democratic Party, he was a major setback, wasn't he? Over the 2 terms he served, roughly 1,100 elected Democrats had lost their positions. Their majorities in the House and Senate went. By the time Trump got into power, the Republicans were stronger than at any time since the 1920s.
Well, I think that what is absolutely the case is that Obama's personal popularity was not transferable to the Democratic Party. And we did make a mistake, I think, in not doing enough to build the institutions of the party during those 8 years.
He was a distant politician. He was described as a distant politician.
Well, not to, I think, ordinary people.
No, I mean inside the party.
Well, in Washington, I think there was this idea of him as distant, but that's not the view that people in the United States or all around the world had. I think the voters felt quite connected to Obama, and he, I think, uniquely among American politicians in the last couple of generations, was able to forge a connection with people.
But the Democratic congressman, for instance, Jerry Connolly, was one of those who couldn't understand why there was such a lack of communication between the White House and Democrats on Capitol Hill. He said, people like me, this was in 2014, this was way into the presidency, people like me want to be allies. I mean, I am an ally, so work with us, reach out to us. You know, we're not the enemy.
Well,
to actually say things like that.
Yeah, we take one Democratic House member.
No, but he wasn't alone in that, was he?
Well, I think we had a very good relationship with Democrats in the House. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, I mean, that's the only way we passed the health care law, the Wall Street reform, all of the major initiatives of the Obama presidency relied on very close cooperation with Democrats in the House. I write in the book that there was this idea that Democrats, or in particular Republicans, would criticize Obama for not reaching out. When he did, they wouldn't extend a hand in return. I have an anecdote where he invited the entire...
Which is saying you couldn't win whatever you did.
Not with Republicans. We made every effort to reach out to Republicans. And I think anybody who's fair, who looks at the Obama presidency, would see that in a Mitch McConnell or in the Republican House, these were not people who were going to work with Obama under any circumstances. They had a strategy of obstruction, and no politician in Barack Obama's shoes was going to be able to shift them off of that.
You, during the course of your time in the White House with Obama, you had plenty of doubts about policies, plenty of debates, but you never seriously believed, to use that phrase, that you were on the wrong side of history, did you?
No.
On his last trip abroad as President Obama, as president, he suddenly asked you, what if we were wrong? Mm-hmm. Maybe we pushed too far. Maybe people just want to fall back into their tribe. Sometimes I wonder if I was 10 or 20 years too early. And you in the book, you answer that question. You say, we were right. Mm-hmm. But all that progress depended on him, and now he was out of time. If you were that right, how come you'll always be known as the people who held the door open for Donald Trump?
Well, look, I think that I don't believe that's how we'll be known. I believe very strongly that the future of American politics is going to look a lot more like Barack Obama than Donald Trump. History did not stop the day that Donald Trump was elected.
But his election was a rebuke to the policies that you stood for by over 60 million Americans, wasn't it?
Well, and 63 million Americans.
63 million?
No, 63 million Americans voted for Hillary Clinton. I was going to say that if the next election is a rebuke of Donald Trump, and that president picks up on the progress
You're talking about
Obama
the midterms.
Well, we already won the midterms. I'm talking about the presidential election. History has not delivered its verdict on this. And I believe that history will move in the direction that Barack Obama pointed us in, that that's the direction of American politics. I believe that that can be the direction of global politics, and that, frankly, we will be proved to be right, that Obama will look like the person who is pointing us in the direction that things ultimately moved, and Donald Trump will look like the last expression of a kind of reactionary politics that ultimately is on the wrong side of history.
But Donald Trump campaigned on the premise that he was going to sweep away a lot of your key policies, and he's tried to do that, and in some cases he has done that, and that was a successful vote winner as far as he was concerned, wasn't it?
Well, history didn't end in 2017, though, is what I'm saying. And
it didn't.
It was not necessarily a successful vote winner because he tried to take apart Obama's health care law and failed, and Democrats just won.
He's taken apart part of it.
Well, the basic law is in place, and Democrats just won a resounding midterm election running on a commitment to protect Obama's legacy and to protect Obamacare.
Well, the midterms aren't necessarily a reflection on how the next presidential election is going to go, are they?
Well, no, but you point to the 2016 election as this seismic historic event, which it was. Well, then the 2018 election, people were able to take a look at Donald Trump's course of action, and the pendulum swung back very quickly to Democrats. And I believe if you see that pendulum continue to swing back, people will say that in the long run, Barack Obama was the one who was moving in the direction that the country was going in, and Donald Trump was the one moving out of step.
It's a big if, though, isn't it?
Of course it is.
In January 2017, the Boston Globe wrote that the consequences of Obama's presidency had been stark, as they put it. A Middle East awash in blood and bombs, US troops re-embroiled in Iraq and Afghanistan, aggressive dictators ascendant, human rights and democracy in retreat. A lot of bad stuff. You don't see it that way, do you?
No. Well, look, the Middle East was awash in conflict when we came into office. The idea that somehow Barack Obama initiated those trends.
No, it's not that he initiated it. He just didn't stop it.
Well, yes, he didn't stop it. And I think, and frankly, though, in terms of U.S. troops, there were 180,000 U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan when we took office. There were 15,000 when we left. So we did begin and make significant progress in the work of extricating the United States from those wars.
But you're pretty kind to yourselves, aren't you, when it comes to legacy? Obama put it on leaving office. Almost every country on earth sees America as stronger and more respected today than they did 8 years ago. Really?
Yes.
That was a big claim. China, with its new fortress islands in the South China Sea. Russia, backing separatists in Crimea and Ukraine and hacking into everything it could get. Israel saw you as more respected? I don't think so.
They didn't. Israel didn't. If you look at what he's referring to there, if you look at any public opinion survey, it shows the enormous majority of countries have an entirely different view of the United States under President Obama than they did under President Bush.
Let's talk about Israel for a moment, though.
Okay, but
because
there are 200.
didn't.
But wait a second. This is important. There are 200 countries in the world, right?
Yeah.
The vast majority of them believe that Barack Obama's brand of leadership was far better than either George Bush's or Donald Trump's. You see the curve go like this under Obama, and then like this under Trump. In Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa. And so we can talk about Israel, where President Obama had very sharp differences with a right-wing government led by Bibi Netanyahu, but I don't think that
it wasn't just the sharp differences. There were deep contradictions in your Middle East policy, weren't there?
Well,
you had core beliefs, but you voted against them yourself, didn't you?
To anchor on Israel, this was rooted largely in the Iran nuclear agreement. And if we had to do it over again, if the price of having a better relationship with Israel was not having an Iran nuclear agreement and potentially going to war with Iran, that was not a price that we were going to pay. And so we were able to make a stand on principle on this issue that did cause a rupture with the Israeli government.
But when it came to things like settlements, you voted against your principles. In 2011, the administration, Susan Rice, said, "We reject in the strongest terms the legitimacy of continued settlement activity. It violates Israel's international commitments, devastates trust between parties, and threatens the prospects for peace." And just after that, the US went and voted against a UN resolution that used almost exactly the same words. In other words, and with really only one exception at the end of President Obama's tenure, you consistently voted against your own principles at the UN. Why?
On settlements.
On settlements, yeah.
Well, at the end in 2016.
But that was a key issue.
At the end in 2016, we did allow for a resolution to go forward.
Yeah, but on many occasions you had voted against your principles. That was never going to be a winning formula, was it?
Well, again, our position in 2011, right, was that there was still a peace effort underway, that if you had a process at the UN, it would foreclose any possibility of having a negotiated settlement between Israelis and Palestinians. But clearly that proved to be wrong. I'm trying to agree with you.
You're trying to find a way through this.
No, I'm not. I'm telling you we were wrong. I mean, I don't know how more plainly I can say this. We thought that we could, through a negotiated process with the Israelis and Palestinians, test whether or not peace was possible. And that was not. And we tried very hard in 2010, 2011, then John Kerry, when he became Secretary of State, to negotiate something between the Israelis and Palestinians. I think anybody looking at this would think in 2011 that if we had gone the route of the United Nations, that Israel would not have come into those negotiations. We tested that proposition. It did not work. And so in 2016, when this came up for a vote again, we supported it.
Let's look at political courage in terms of the Arab Spring, because to an administration that campaigned on a slogan of hope and change, the Arab Spring should have been right up your street, shouldn't it? But Egypt was a case in point. After the demonstrations that got rid of Hosni Mubarak, the old dictator, Obama backed the Egyptian Military Council known as SCAF. And you quote him saying in the book, "Our priority has to be stability and supporting the SCAF." Mm-hmm. It wasn't just supporting stability, it was supporting repression. Because you knew by then what SCAF stood for.
Well, and I quote that as one of the policies I disagreed with.
Yeah.
My concern with our Egypt policy.
But he threw the young people, the April 6th movement, he threw them under the bus, didn't he?
Well,
comprehensively. By backing the Egyptian Military Council, which went on to torture people with industrial efficiency.
What I believe is that we made this initial decision to support the Arab Spring within Egypt, to break from Mubarak. And then I believe that the habits, deep-rooted habits of the U.S. government were to engage the people that the U.S. government knew, and that's the Egyptian military, the Egyptian security services. And I believe that that was a mistake. I believe that,
you still believe that it was a mistake.
And by the way, I'm in a tiny minority in that regard. I think most people believe that we should have been even more in support of the Egyptian military. But I believe
really, after killing 800 people in a single day in the Rabat square?
Look at the praise that is heaped on President Sisi in the United States. Absolutely. But
this isn't you being right. You said, as we talked about earlier, you thought we were right. This is a big instance where you weren't right, wasn't it?
When I say, to be very clear, when I say we were right, I mean the orientation of Barack Obama's politics, the vision that he has for the United States and the world, I believe is fundamentally right. That does not mean that every single decision that you make in the course of 8 years is right.
Jake Sullivan, who you worked with in the White House, former National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, he's critical of the Obama administration on human rights. He said not enough was done to elevate the priority of human rights and reform in the case of Saudi Arabia. Fair criticism?
Yeah, I mean, I myself have been very critical of the Saudis.
But he's talking about your policy failing to elevate.
But we did, I do think there are cases, if you look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia versus Donald Trump's, right, there is a reason that you have seen a much more unbound Saudi leadership in the last 2 years. We were raising human rights cases. We were raising cases of people who'd been detained. We were trying to restrain.
What about the Yemen war? Because Sullivan points out, if you take something like the conflict in Yemen, which has caused massive loss of life, it was the Obama administration which began the support for the Saudi-led coalition in that effort.
Yes, but what
big mistake.
But wait, what we did, this I think would be very different than the Trump administration. It was very conditional support. We would withhold weapons from the Saudis if we thought that they were engaged in overextension. We would not support.
They were engaged in overextension right from the start.
And we pulled back.
There's prima facie evidence, massive evidence of war crimes.
We held back weapons from them. I believe that the war in Yemen was wrong. I believe it was wrong from the start. But I do believe you have to draw a contrast between the conduct of that war in Yemen after Trump came into office and before Trump came into office. And what you saw is all the constraints come off the Saudi-led coalition. You saw a significant escalation of that war. You saw a significant escalation of the risk to the humanitarian situation in Yemen. So I do believe we were.
But Sullivan is right to say that you shouldn't have started.
Jake he's my closest friend. I mean, we authored a letter together to Congress, Jake and I, urging Congress to vote to suspend all U.S. assistance to the war in Yemen. And so, I'm obviously aligned with his views, but I do think you have to draw a contrast between the U.S. and the restraints that we would place on the Saudis, not just in Yemen, but in the region, which caused many tensions. If we were sitting here in 2016, you'd probably be asking me, isn't this a big problem that the Saudis are so critical of Obama's foreign policy and that you have these differences? The reality is when Trump came in the door, they got everything they wanted. The blockade with Qatar is something that we tried to prevent. The escalation of the war in Yemen, the intervention in Lebanese politics, and the accession of Mohammed bin Salman to Crown Prince all took place in the first 6 months after Obama.
You say they got everything they wanted. Russia got quite a lot during your administration, didn't they? They filled the vacuum in the Eastern Mediterranean after your red line was crossed, the so-called red line of chemical weapons usage. The Russians basically kicked sand in your face, didn't they? They gave your forces an hour to get out of the Eastern Mediterranean before they launched their biggest deployment there in decades, which you didn't see coming, did you?
Well,
did you underestimate Putin?
No, I think the reality is Russia has had a presence in Syria for a very long time. Some people talk as if until 2013 or 14, Russia didn't have some.
But they brought in huge deployments.
They brought in more deployments, but they had been pouring arms into Syria for years.
They also blindsided you in Ukraine and Crimea. You didn't see that coming either. did you?
Well, wait, I think what they didn't see coming is the collapse of their client regime in Kiev, right? This is the precipitating event.
But you had gaps, critical gaps in your collection and analysis of what they were doing.
No, that's not. Look, you have to understand what happened in Ukraine, okay? This was not some long-planned Russian invasion of Crimea. What happened was you had a Russian-backed client, a corrupt leader in Kiev, in Yanukovych, who did Russia's bidding. You had protests that ousted that leader. We negotiated something where he would step aside and there would be elections. Yanukovych flees to Russia, and then Russia moves into Crimea.
I understand
so this
that,
is not, but the way you're describing it, this is not the kind of thing where Russia had a multi-year plan to invade Crimea. They saw Ukraine slipping away from them. They saw Ukraine choosing an association agreement with the European Union over dominance from Russia.
But Russia had been identified as a primary threat to U.S. interests, okay?
Yeah.
And yet Breedlove was able to go before a Senate committee in April 2015 and say there were critical gaps in U.S. collection and analysis capabilities where Russia was concerned. So you took your eye off the ball.
Well,
even some Russian exercises, he said, we didn't see them coming.
You can have
even the exercises.
You can have your eye on Russia. I mean, we were watching Russia.
You were a national security advisor.
Yeah, but you're going to have gaps anywhere. I mean,
but this was a huge gap. This was one of your primary foes.
We were watching Russia. The idea that we somehow weren't focused on Russia. You're constantly focused on Russia. You can have gaps.
But that was
when
his
you have
view.
Somebody
that was his view, and he was at the sharp end.
But I'm not saying that there are no gaps anyway. I'm saying that in any issue, anywhere in the world, you're not going to have 100%, intelligence coverage. But this is beside the point. It's the political objective of Putin that is more important than any one intelligence issue. It's the question of what are Putin's motivations and intentions. And his motivations and intentions, I believe, were, once he came back into the presidency, to push back against what he had seen as multi-decade encroachment on Russia's near abroad, a steady collapse of some Russian
And you didn't
climate
realize that until too late.
We realized it pretty early, long before Crimea. I mean, it was obvious when he's taking...
And yet he was able to move and you didn't even see it coming.
In Crimea?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, what do you suggest that we do? Invade Crimea to oust Russia?
But it was a surprise to you.
It was a surprise because it happened because of a chain of events, right? Again, it's not like I disagree fundamentally with the premise that they were sitting here for years waiting to invade Crimea and we missed this. You had a leader that they backed that collapsed in Kiev. You had a leader in Yanukovych who fled to Russia. This was a huge embarrassment to Putin. He saw something, a country, Ukraine, right on his borders, slipping away from any Russian influence. And that's what propels him into Crimea. So even if we had seen that a day earlier, it's not as if we were going to deploy the U.S. military into Crimea to keep those Russian special forces out. Again, I think you have to understand the more important issue here is what are Putin's motivations, and then how does the West respond to those things?
Ben Rhodes, in the short time that we have left, let's look ahead to the next presidential election next year. What kind of Democratic Party do you think is going to be capable of beating Donald Trump with his massive following, his dominance of the airwaves, his dominance of social media, which proved so devastating in the last presidential election? What kind of Democratic Party is going to be able to counteract that?
The massive following is 40%. He is the most unpopular U.S. president to run for re-election in my lifetime.
But he sets the news agenda every day, doesn't he?
Then
He dominates the airwaves.
Then you guys have to take a look at why that is.
You have to live with the world as it is, don't you?
The Democratic Party just routed Donald Trump's Republican Party in the
got
midterm
40
elections.
seats. It won 40 seats in the House.
Yeah, and won by the largest popular vote margin in the history of a midterm election, the largest Democratic victory in the House since Watergate.
And
so I think the Democratic Party is in good shape.
You have more than 10 people suggesting that they're going to be candidates.
Good. We should have a big field. And what kind of Democratic
But nobody
Party?
knows any of their names. Nobody knows what they stand for. There's no slogan.
You don't know any of these people?
What does the party stand for? What's their name recognition in the country as a whole? In some cases,
what was
not
Barack
much.
Obama's name recognition in 2007? The Democratic Party, when we nominate somebody who is a new face, who is a reformer, an outsider, Barack Obama, Governor Bill Clinton, Governor Jimmy Carter, those are the people who've won. people knew who Hillary Clinton was, and Al Gore was, and John Kerry was.
You're going to fight
and
Trump
we
on
lost.
Trump's own ground?
We're better to run with in our message a new face to come in and say that we're going to bring change. We're the ones who are going to pick up the work of giving people more health care, of building a more inclusive economy, of cooperating with other nations, of restoring America's standing in the world. And that's the message that is popular in the United States.
Isn't it a fact that incumbents lose, oppositions don't win? Donald Trump has to trip himself up for you to win, doesn't he?
Donald Trump trips himself up every single day, right?
And gets away with it.
No, he doesn't. He just lost in the midterm elections dramatically, right? I think there's a
People
huge...
lose in midterms and still go on to win the presidency.
But there's a huge overstatement of Donald Trump's political standing in the United States outside of the United States. I'm continually struck by this. He is an historically unpopular figure right now in the United States. The Democratic Party in every poll outpolls the Republican Party. The enthusiasm in the United States is with the Democratic Party. The recent election results are with the Democratic Party.
Okay.
And I believe that we clearly have the better chance of winning this election. That does not make it a guarantee. We had the better chance in 2016, and we lost. So we need to have the right candidate and the right message, but I think we will.
Ben Rhodes, good to have you on the program. Thanks very much.
Thank you.